So here you have, just some examples of the 2nd and 3rd century of, how you have these groups going all over the place. Now, certainly I'm not saying like Gnosticism, the situation with Gnosticism is exactly what we're talking about with the denominations today. But what we're seeing here, again, is that this, as we go through time, teachers and leaders are always developing, and they're developing their own types of groups, many of which times they think of themselves as Christians, but we see some distinct differences. Heretical differences, quite different than, what we would necessarily say today, but just the idea of division having such deep roots in Christianity. And that's only fostered, as we get through to the 4th century, 5th century, those kind of things. And so as we get into the 4th century, we see some important changes taking place. One of the other topics we're going to talk about is church and state. And so we'll spend more time talking about Constantine in that topic. But Constantine, who becomes the first emperor to legitimize Christianity, to adopt a Christian identity, brings now the power of the state into these types of discussions. And so prior to this, Christianity is, marginalized in the Roman Empire. The empire, the leaders, they're pagan. Obviously, there's some times that Christianity is being persecuted and those kind of things. But you now have the power of the state behind all of this. And as Constantine enters this picture, one of the things that's important here is that Constantine exerts influence, but he does so more often than not in the desires of peace in his empire rather than theological accuracy, right? So sometimes when there's differences, his concern is not so much about, right, is this the correct teaching? And more often than not, it's about, what's going to bring peace to the empire. With that, it also brings the changes in the leadership of the church. Throughout the 2nd century, the 3rd century, with these developments of apostolic tradition, apostolic succession, there were some leaders of churches that were looked upon as very influential because of their connection with important places or important people. So Jerusalem, of course, the city of Alexandria in Egypt, the city of Antioch in Syria. That's where Christians, or where disciples of Jesus were first called Christians. It was the home church of Paul as he went out on his various missionary journeys. There's the city of Constantinople that becomes important in Asia Minor, what's modern-day Turkey, especially after Constantine moves his government there, right, and moves from Rome to the city of Constantinople. And then, of course, there is the city of Rome, connected with both Paul and Peter. Throughout the 2nd, 3rd, into the 4th century, the Bishop of Rome, of course, has a lot of authority. People respect him, look upon him as being very important, very influential. But more and more, the bishops of Rome, right, as one bishop succeeds another, right, one dies off and the next one comes up, more and more they are trying to claim for themselves almost a universal leadership. The churches should submit to the guidance of the Bishop of Rome. Because of the connections with Paul and Peter, because of the orthodoxy of Rome, because Rome is the seat of the empire, right, the capital. And a lot of people in the West start buying some of those arguments. In the East, however, there isn't the same kind of acceptance. A lot of people in the East reject that type of claim. Instead, the model they want to see is a model where the leaders of different churches, the patriarchs, work together. It's more of a collegial discussion of matters important to the church instead of, one particular individual. The Bishop of Rome will eventually get the name Pope, related to the Latin word for father. Patriarch, of course, is connected with the Greek word for father. But they have a different idea of what does the father of the church do. So in the East, they see the Bishop of Rome as another patriarch. They're not denying that Rome is an important church. They're not denying the wisdom of the bishop at Rome or the patriarch of Rome. But they don't think he's the universal head of the church. And so there's division between East and West over models of leadership, what kind of claims a particular church official can make, what kind of authority operates in the church, a more collegial or a more hierarchical. And so you see the development of this hierarchy that takes place in the West. There's a hierarchy that develops in the East, but it's a slightly different model. Eventually, though, throughout the Middle Ages, there will be splits. There are all sorts of issues that come up, and they lead to kind of the development of, on the one hand, on the western part, Roman Catholicism, and in the eastern part, what's known as Orthodox Christianity, usually connected with a specific ethnicity. So Greek Orthodox, later Russian Orthodox, some other types of nationalities and ethnicities develop there as well. So those splits develop, and often in those later years of the medieval period, there is a questioning of whether the other group is truly Christian. Right? So during the Crusades, the Roman Catholic Church won't just send soldiers to the Holy Land to try and free it from Muslim control. They're also sending missionaries to the eastern part of the church to try and convert them to Roman Catholicism, which of course is not very welcome, right? So there's a lot of things that take place. So you have these two groups, right? Or Catholicism on the one hand, Orthodox Christianity on the other hand. And there's a lot of things that we're predominantly focusing on in the West, where as the West develops into this model of a pope at the top with a hierarchy underneath him, that a lot of those church offices become places of corruption, right? People wanting to buy their right into the leadership, right? And so instead of being selected as a leader because you are a moral person who has demonstrated a Christian character, right? You become the bishop of this particular city because you paid a certain amount of money. And that happens even with the papacy. Sometimes the popes in the Catholic Church, were put in completely horrible, immoral people. And so that corruption infects a lot. Now, not all Catholics were corrupt. Right? Not all popes were corrupt. But it does become a problem in Catholicism. And so out of that, there were various times throughout the Middle Ages where people attempted to bring about reform, right? Wanting to see moral reform, right? The church leaders become greater examples of Christian character, and so a lot of people concerned for reform. Now, often, again, the focus is not, get rid of the hierarchy. Go back to the more autonomous model of the first century, adopt a plurality of leaders. That's not so much the concern. The concern is moral reform. But still, you have this idea that there needs to be some type of reform take place. Furthermore, as we get toward the end of the medieval period, right, the 1300s into the 1400s, you see the development of a variety of fields of study that are now going to bring challenges to Christianity. Particularly, we're talking Western Christianity, Catholicism. And Catholicism is essentially it in the West. Particularly important was the idea of humanism. Now, humanism was an interest in all things human. All right, what does it mean to be a human being? What helps human beings flourish? And particularly interesting to a lot of these humanist authors were ancient Greek and Roman texts. They wanted to go back and read the Greek philosophers, or they wanted to read Roman legal scholars, right? And so in this Renaissance, you have this concern of old texts, old ways of thinking, classical learning, those kind of things. Well, one of the things that becomes an interest of many humanists is returning to the original languages of the Bible. By the Middle Ages, in the West, the Bible is only available in Latin, the Latin Vulgate, which had been translated in the 4th century. But the Bible wasn't originally written in Latin. It was written in Hebrew, some parts are in Aramaic, and the New Testament, of course, was written in Greek. And so these humanists are interested in going back and recovering these Greek texts, trying to understand the New Testament in Greek. And as they do, they begin to challenge some of the teachings of the Catholic Church because they don't find in the passages of Scripture some of the teachings that the Church is teaching. Furthermore, they find that there are some places in the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, that have misunderstood or misinterpreted when they were translating from the Latin or from the Greek to the Latin. And so the need to change is what some of these humanists bring forth, because they're saying, well, in the original languages, it was different than what we're seeing, in today, in the modern culture.